You have been lied to about money your entire life. You were told wealth is the reward for working hard, for being honest, for providing value. But if that were true, the hardest workers on earth would all be rich. They aren't, because money does not move according to fairness. Money moves according to psychology. Every day, billions of dollars move from one person to another, not because of logic, but because someone understood how the human mind bends under pressure. Boardrooms. Sales floors. Investment deals. Political campaigns. Behind every major transaction is the same invisible weapon: psychological leverage. A small group of operators understand something the average person never learns. They know how to manufacture urgency, trigger ego, weaponize scarcity, and make people feel like buying was their own idea. Once you understand these hidden psychological switches, you stop chasing money. Money begins moving toward you. In this video, I will show you 7 ruthless psychological mechanisms used by elite negotiators, high-level sales operators, and power strategists to make money change hands. But understand something first. These tactics do not work on the surface. They work under the skin of the human mind. And once you see them, you will never look at a transaction the same way again. Most people believe money flows through the market based on fairness. Work harder, provide value, charge a fair price. That is the story society tells. But the real market behaves very differently. Money moves towards psychological certainty, not fairness. In every negotiation, every sale, every investment pitch, there is an invisible battlefield. Logic is not the main weapon, emotion is. And the person who controls the emotional environment of the deal controls where the money flows. This is where the first law of ruthless persuasion appears, the law of asymmetrical obligation. The amateur seller tries to prove value. They explain features, they show charts, they compare prices. In other words, they beg the buyer's brain to make a logical decision. But humans rarely buy through logic. They buy through emotional imbalance. Elite operators create that imbalance through something far more powerful than value. They create psychological debt. When a person feels they owe you something emotionally, their brain begins searching for a way to repay that obligation. And the easiest way to repay it is often the simplest. They give you their money. But here is where most people misunderstand this concept. Giving something small for free, a discount or a sample, is weak. That is beginner psychology. The real technique is perceived sacrifice. You give something that appears expensive or risky for you, but costs you almost nothing. Imagine a negotiation. Instead of pitching immediately, you lower your voice and say, "I normally don't show this to new clients. My partners prefer we keep this strategy internal, but I think you might be someone who could actually use it." Instantly, something shifts in the buyer's mind. They feel chosen. Now they are not just hearing a pitch. They are receiving something that feels exclusive. This triggers a powerful neurological response. The brain hates feeling indebted. Psychologists call this reciprocity pressure. When someone receives an unexpected favor, their nervous system begins searching for balance. That tension sits in the chest like a weight. And the fastest way to remove that weight is to reciprocate. Signing the deal becomes a form of emotional relief. The buyer believes they are making a rational choice. But in reality, they are simply trying to restore psychological equilibrium. And that is only the beginning, because the second mechanism is far more dangerous. The manufactured problem. There is a brutal truth about selling. People rarely buy solutions. They buy relief from pain. If a person feels safe, comfortable, and stable, their wallet stays closed. No urgency, no transaction. Elite persuaders understand something critical. If the buyer cannot see the danger, they reveal it. Sometimes they even create it. This does not mean lying. It means exposing a problem so clearly that it becomes impossible to ignore. Consider a simple example. An average consultant says, "This strategy could increase your revenue by 30%. A psychological strategist says, "Based on the numbers you showed me, you've probably lost close to $400,000 in the last 2 years because of this system." Notice the difference. The first sells opportunity. The second reveals loss. Human beings react far more strongly to loss than gain. This is known as loss aversion. The pain of losing money feels nearly twice as intense as the pleasure of gaining the same amount. So the strategist does not sell growth, they reveal bleeding. And once the buyer sees the bleeding, they start searching for a tourniquet, which leads us to the next mechanism, one that shifts the power dynamic entirely. The savior position. Once the buyer believes there is a serious problem, The worst mistake you can make is immediately presenting the solution. That relieves tension too quickly. Instead, elite operators allow the discomfort to grow. They ask deeper questions. How long has this been affecting your margins? What happens if the market tightens next year? What would that cost you over 5 years? Every question sharpens the pain. Every answer comes from the buyer's own mouth. Now something powerful happens. The buyer begins convincing themselves that they need help. When the solution finally appears, it does not feel like a sales pitch. It feels like rescue. And people rarely negotiate with their rescuer. They comply. This is the moment when the seller stops being a vendor and becomes something much more powerful. The person holding the exit door. But even this level of persuasion can fail if the buyer feels pressured. That is why elite operators use another strategy, a strategy that feels completely counterintuitive. They take away control, but they do it in a way that makes the buyer feel more powerful. Human beings guard their money for one primary reason: control. Money represents freedom, safety, and personal power. The moment someone feels that power is being taken away, they resist, push too hard in a negotiation, and the buyer's brain activates its defense systems. They become skeptical, suspicious, closed. That is why elite persuaders do something unexpected. They remove pressure entirely, not because they are weak, but because they understand a deeper rule of psychology. People trust decisions that feel like their own idea, like the illusion of autonomy. Imagine two sales conversations. In the first scenario, the seller says, "You need this solution. It's the best option available." The buyer immediately becomes defensive. Their brain begins searching for flaws. Now imagine a different approach. This solution is extremely aggressive. Most companies aren't actually ready for it. Suddenly the buyer leans forward. "What do you mean?" Instead of pushing the buyer toward the product, and the seller pulls it away. And this activates something powerful, ego. When people feel they are being excluded from something valuable, their brain reacts instantly, not with caution, with curiosity, and sometimes with competition. They want to prove they belong. Now the buyer begins selling themselves. They explain why they are ready, why they can handle the scale, why they deserve access. The seller is no longer convincing anyone. The buyer is convincing themselves. This reversal is one of the most powerful persuasion techniques ever discovered. But it only works if the seller maintains one critical psychological posture: indifference. The power of indifference, desperation, is detectable. Even if you hide it with perfect words, the human nervous system senses it. Tiny signals reveal everything: voice tension, breathing changes, eye movement, hesitation. When a buyer senses desperation, the power dynamic flips. Now they control the negotiation. That is why elite negotiators train themselves to project calm inevitability. When they present a price, they do it the same way someone states the weather. No excitement, no apology. No justification, just clarity. The investment required is $120,000. Then silence. Silence is uncomfortable. Most salespeople rush to fill it. They explain features, they defend the price. But that behavior signals insecurity. Confidence does the opposite, it holds the silence. And in that silence, the buyer's brain begins calculating something else. If he's this calm, he must not need my money. And that thought changes everything. Scarcity creates value. Desperation destroys it. But there is still one psychological trigger stronger than scarcity: identity. Identity infection. The most powerful purchases humans make are not about utility. They are about identity. People do not buy expensive watches to tell time. They buy them to feel powerful. People do not buy luxury cars to travel. They buy them to signal status. Behind every purchase lies a deeper question: who does this make me? Elite persuaders understand this. Instead of selling a product, they sell a version of the buyer themselves. This begins with a simple psychological move: labeling. Before presenting the offer, the strategist assigns the buyer a high-status identity. You strike me as someone who makes decisions based on numbers, not emotion. The buyer accepts the compliment, but now something subtle has happened. Their brain wants to live up to that identity. When the price appears, hesitation would contradict the label. So the easiest way to remain consistent with that identity is to act decisively. In other words, they buy. And when identity becomes attached to a purchase, price becomes far less important. But the deepest psychological lever has not yet appeared, because humans are not only motivated by ego, they are also haunted by regret. There is one emotion that can overpower almost every other decision-making process in the human brain: regret. The fear that you have already lost something you cannot recover. Most sales strategies focus on the future, how much you will gain. But elite psychological operators do the opposite. They focus on the past. They reveal what has already been lost. Weaponized regret. Imagine a consultant speaking to a business owner. An amateur says, "This strategy could increase your profits next year." But the strategist says something very different. "Based on your data, this inefficiency has probably cost you around $300,000 over the last 3 years. Now the buyer feels something visceral, not hope, pain, because that money is gone, irrecoverable. And the brain immediately asks a desperate question: how do I stop this from continuing? At that moment, the solution is no longer optional. It becomes a tourniquet, something that stops the bleeding. And people pay almost anything to stop emotional bleeding. But the final psychological mechanism is even more powerful, because it does not just influence decisions, it creates allegiance. The shared enemy. Humans bond faster through conflict than through friendship. Two strangers may struggle to connect through polite conversation, but introduce a common enemy, and they unite instantly. Elite persuaders use this principle constantly. They position the buyer and themselves on the same side of a battle. The enemy might be a broken system, outdated industry rules, giant institutions, market manipulation. Suddenly, the conversation changes. The seller is no longer trying to extract money. They are offering a weapon. The buyer is not purchasing a service. They are joining a strategy. And when people feel they are part of a rebellion against a system, logic weakens, emotion takes over. But the final move, and the move that separates amateurs from masters, is the most counterintuitive of all: rejection. Exclusive nightclubs use a simple psychological trick. They place a rope at the entrance. A line forms outside, even if the club inside is half empty. Why? Because restriction creates desire. The same rule applies in persuasion. When a deal begins slipping away, most sellers chase. They offer discounts, they push harder. Elite operators do the opposite. They pull back. "I'm starting to think this isn't the right fit for you." This statement shocks the buyer. Their brain was preparing to reject the offer. But suddenly the offer rejects them. And that triggers one of the strongest psychological reactions in the human mind: status defense. The buyer now feels the need to prove something, to prove they are capable, qualified, powerful enough to participate. And many times, they close the deal themselves. Money is not simply numbers in a bank account. It is stored human energy, and transactions are not purely logical exchanges. They are psychological negotiations between two minds. Most people spend their lives chasing money through effort alone. But the small group who understand human psychology design environments where money flows toward them naturally, not through force, through influence. Once you understand these invisible dynamics, something changes. You stop begging for opportunities. You begin engineering them. If this video opened your eyes, understand something. What you just learned is only the surface level of psychological influence. There are deeper mechanisms, darker ones, that cannot be discussed openly on this platform. Techniques used in intelligence operations, elite negotiation rooms, and high-level influence campaigns. That is why some of the most powerful content on this channel is not public. If you want access to the deeper material, the uncensored breakdowns of power psychology, you can unlock them through the join button below. Also, if you want to master the psychology of power, influence, and human behavior, make sure you subscribe to Ruthless Psychology. Because once you understand how the mind works, you stop being manipulated by the world, and you start shaping it